Today we're joined by Sian Norris. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be doing an episode called The Dark Economy of Mail Order Brides. And just for listeners who aren't familiar with the platform, this is Global Rights Defenders. It's a nonprofit dedicated to helping and advocating alongside marginalized, displaced, and vulnerable populations. And we're using this podcast as a type of vehicle to push forward human rights objectives and human rights issues that need to be confronted. So Sian Norris is a writer and feminist activist with a specific focus on reproductive and LGBTIQ rights. Her work has been published in Open Democracy 50/50, The Guardian, The Eye, New Statesman, Byline Times, politics.co.uk, and many more. Her book, Birth Violence, explores how the far right is attacking women's reproductive rights in Europe and will be published by Verso in autumn 2022. That is a very topical issue, of course, as we're watching Roe versus Wade in the United States. And she's also the founder of Bristol Women's Literature Festival. So thank you so much, Sian, for joining us today. We're so happy that you could be here.
Thank you for having me. It's really good to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so could you tell us a little bit about yourself, like why you became a journalist and what your specific interests are?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently I'm working at a newspaper called Byline Times. I'm their chief social affairs and European reporter. And before that, I was freelancing at various publications in the ones you listed. And I really got into journalism because I was very interested in telling stories about, well, women's rights in particular and marginalized communities. And was really aware that there were so many issues and so many active women and communities that were trying to sort of do really important work to improve their lives and the lives of the people around them. And yet so often we didn't get to hear about their stories and we didn't get to hear about what they were doing and the actions they were taking. So I was really keen to become a journalist and write those stories and engage with those activists and campaigners and groups. And also, a big area of my interest as a journalist is looking at sort of the kind of the rollback of women's rights and the sort of the backlash against women's rights. And so I've been very keen in getting involved with investigative projects looking specifically at how disinformation channels and disinformation is used to prevent women from accessing reproductive health care and abortions. I've been really interested in looking at how money from the US and from anti-gender organizations in Europe and money from Russia has been used to kind of roll back women's rights or attack women's rights across the region. And sort of towards the end of last year, I did quite a lot of reporting around Afghanistan and the sort of unfolding situation there, of a particular focus on the UK's response to refugees and the refugee crisis that was brewing. So lots of things, really. I get to write about lots of stuff, but my main focus is kind of investigating those women's rights issues, from sexual harassment to reproductive violence and sexual rights as well.
Very important topics, and I just feel so lucky to have you as a speaker today. I just know that you're so knowledgeable, and yeah, it's really important work that you're doing. So could you please define for us what a mail order bride is and why might it be controversial?
So mail order brides is this kind of really odd term in that it sort of positions women in two very distinct ways. First of all, you have the bride. We're talking about a woman who is defined by becoming a bride. She's not a wife, she's not a person. And there's all those kind of connotations around bride that is kind of like virginal and naive and at the start of life, the start of something. And then mail order, which is, this kind of commodification, that she's a product that you can just buy on the internet. So in terms of what it means when you go looking for mail order brides, as it were, these are sort of women who sort of put themselves on these websites, sign up to these sort of dating websites effectively, but with the kind of purpose of getting married at the end of it. And generally it's targeted at foreign men. So, if you're a woman in Eastern Europe and you sign up to one of these dating websites, these dating websites tend to focus on kind of men in Western countries such as the US or the UK or Western Europe. And you matched with a man on there, just like in a normal dating website. and then you arrange to marry him and come and live with him his country of origin. And I think as well, it's really interesting when we think about mail order brides, because just like people use dating websites all the time. Like that's kind of a very normal way to meet people these days. But I think there's something very specific about the power dynamics when we talk about mail order brides, because these are always men living in one country, generally a wealthier country, a global north country, a developed economy, sort of a sort of what we used to call a first world country, although that term is not really appropriate anymore. And the women often living in much poorer countries or sort of developing countries with weaker economies, and they're kind of looking to move to the West in order to have a sort of better life. But what you end up with is this power dynamic around the man in the sort of Western country being the sort of gateway for this woman to come to this life. And depending on a country's immigration laws, you could have huge amounts of power imbalances. So in the UK where I live, people can come to the UK on a spousal visa, but there's all sorts of restrictions that are put on that. You may not be allowed to work for a long time. You may become completely financially dependent on your husband. And even in the most equal, loving, ideal relationships, that kind of power imbalance is going to create tensions and problems because someone is completely dependent on their partner. And so I think, this isn't the same as, going on match.com and going on a few dates and finding someone you like and seeing how it goes. This is a very kind of transactional way of meeting another woman, that relies a lot on stereotypes about what that woman will be like, and then creates a sort of very uneven power dynamic should the relationship develop and the couple get married and the woman moves over to the UK or the US or another kind of global north country.
Yeah, you touched on some really important topics there. You touched on immigration issues, you talked about nationalism, you talked about the exploitation, power dynamics, all of which we're going to get a little bit deeper into. But the term mail order bride is kind of a colloquial term that we use for human trafficking. And human trafficking, as you just explained, has all of these tenets in it. To define human trafficking, 3 elements must exist: the act itself, which is the recruitment, transportation, harbor, or the receipt, through the second, which is the means to use force or coercion, power to achieve consent of a person to coming towards you. And this is all for the purpose of exploitation, which is the third element, which includes slavery and practices similar to slavery, servitude, forced prostitution, sexual exploitation. So all of these elements absolutely exist under the definition of mail order bride, and yet we're using it as kind of like a fun, modern term where it's just kind of accepted. It's one of those things that people just turn a blind eye to intentionally. There's intentionality behind it as well for women specifically, as you mentioned. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I think as well, like the exploitation, is people are making money out of this, and it's not the men or the women, it's the businesses that run these websites, and you have to pay a lot of money to act. Like when I was doing this undercover investigation on mail order brides, I mean, I didn't pay for anything. I didn't give the services any money. Had very, very strict boundaries when I was going through the investigation. But it was constantly saying like, oh, pay this much money and then you can chat, pay this much money and then you can see your likes, pay this much money and you can have these extra services, this extra access to women. And so really, the sort of the layers of exploitation are quite complex, but ultimately this is some big businesses who are winning out of desperation on many levels.
Absolutely. And a lot of these, as they're called in the literature, international marriage organizations, there's just kind of an umbrella term that was given to them. They've been linked to criminal trafficking in several ways. Adults and girls can be offered as brides to the public, but sold privately into prostitution, forced marriage, or held in domestic slavery. So they're still running rampant, and it's still coming across as a legitimate business model in many countries. So what are the main reasons that women enter these websites in the first place?
Well, as I mentioned, I think, a good reason is to to move country, to like, if you are living in a country with a weak economy or a depressed economy, or you don't feel like you have a lot of life chances, you're living in poverty or with high inequality, then the idea of moving to a country that you view as more prosperous, as more modern, where you might have better opportunities to get work that you're interested in, those are all really good reasons to do it. Interestingly, when I was looking at mail order bride websites, the pitch to women is that, in the West, and I'm using the word West advisedly, like in it's just sort of the shorthand for the kind of G7 economies, that kind of area. It's kind of presented as like, oh, men in these countries are more modern, they're more open-minded, they're more progressive, like perhaps in the countries where lots of women go on these websites, such as in Eastern Europe or in some countries in the global south, they're much more traditional, sort of small c conservative societies. So women are kind of sold this notion of like, oh, you'll meet like a kind of cool progressive Western guy who will be cool if you're going to work, and like has these progressive values and less traditional than your home country. Conversely, the pitch to men is that women from these countries will be really submissive, they'll be really small c conservative, they'll be very traditional, they'll be like homebodies who want to serve their man, and they won't be like these nasty feminist women where you live and who have funny ideas about having human rights. And of course, I mean, it's just so offensive to women in all countries when they make this kind of comparison. And so it's interesting that the pitch to women signing up to the sites is so divorced from the pitch to the men signing up to find a wife, that they're sort of given this promise of a kind of more Western progressive husband, and the men are being told, oh no, you'll get a lovely submissive obedient lady who will also be completely wild in bed and fulfill every sexual fantasy you've ever had. But crucially, the reason that I looked into mail order brides was because of the situation in Ukraine, and so I'd kind of been hearing that because we have this visa system in the UK that they launched at the start of the war in Ukraine, that you can come to the UK if you can get a sponsor. So they asked members of the public to sign up to a scheme called Homes for Ukraine, and then you would be matched with a Ukrainian refugee who could come and live with you. And this was, everybody, as soon as this announced, was like, this is a safeguarding nightmare. Like, there are just so many issues with this scheme. And one of the issues that was that people were saying, oh, we've been seeing women go on dating websites to try and find men or try and find people to match with so that they can come and live in the UK under this scheme as a refugee. And so I thought, okay, well, if that's the case, I wonder if, there's going to be any activity on these mail order bride websites. And what I found was, when I was doing the investigation, I was on a website and lots of chat boxes would come up. So women would be trying to start conversations with me. And I didn't respond to any, I didn't engage with anybody. Like I said, I had very clear boundaries about what was acceptable to do on these websites. But more than a few raised the refugee issue, and they were like, can refugees work in the UK? And sort of asking questions about whether there were many refugees in the UK. And so it was kind of like, okay, so that is a reason for signing up to become a mail order bride. It's not because you want to marry an Englishman, it's because you want to get the hell out of a war zone, and there's not safe legal immigration routes being opened up effectively in order to allow you to do that.
Yeah, it's so sad and so devastating, just the dire situation and how desperate people are to get out of it and what they're willing to put themselves through. I know somebody in Afghanistan who is extremely young, and she's trying to help her family. She's the only educated person in her family. And she didn't actually even sign up to the mail order bride websites. People would sign up under the guise of, let's say, Red Cross. It's not Red Cross, but these big organizations that go in other countries and help, like those types of institutions, people would sign up to volunteer with those organizations and then would solicit to these people that they were trying to help. So they would then go, I can't help you through my organization, but if you want, I can sponsor you to come and live with me. And this person I'm speaking of at the time was 18, and the person reaching out to her was 64. So it's just the
Ah,
exploitation is beyond. And she was considering it because Afghanistan, or to be accepted by UNHCR to come to Canada, you have to go to a third country. So she would have had to go to Pakistan or another neighboring country to then apply to UNHCR, where she could be waiting for years in a refugee camp and then years again once she came to Canada. So, her family didn't want to do that and she needed to get out quickly. And she was seriously considering this option just because it could potentially help her and her family.
and it just speaks to a failure. It speaks to a failure of our response in well, where I am in the UK, but also I guess where you are in Canada, to these refugee crises. The fact that women feel that they don't have options except to kind of go on these dating websites, mail order bride websites. And if we had opened up really clear, safe, legal routes of humanitarian visas, then we
Right.
wouldn't have a situation where you go on a mail order bride website and Ukrainian women are asking whether refugees are allowed to work in the UK. The other thing that I found, which this was actually what made me write the story in the first place, was this article on a kind of aggregate site for mail order bride website. So it was kind of like this website which reviews the best sites, gives you tips on how to, find a lady, gives ratings for the, for like links you to all the different websites. And it did this article, like a long read, being like, why are Ukrainian women so popular right now? And the reason they gave was the war. And it was just such a distressing article. It really engaged with very, very gendered, racialized stereotypes about Eastern European women, that they're all, incredibly beautiful, incredibly sexual, but also very submissive and traditional. And it just, the line that stayed with me, and I swear I will never forget it as long as I live, was when they said that the women are desperate to escape this awful situation, but they're very optimistic and they will be forever grateful to you for rescuing them.
Right,
And you're
grateful.
just like, forever grateful. It's like you're setting up these women as kind of objects who will just, you know, do your every wish because they're so grateful to you. But you're also setting the men up to an expectation. These are women who will be likely deeply traumatized from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
They're not gonna. There's just so much dishonesty and so much cruelty in the way that it's set up. And yeah, this idea of these kind of happy, grateful, optimistic women that you'll be matched with to live happily ever after is just, again, it's these websites exploiting really vulnerable, desperate situations.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that as well, because in doing some research for this episode, I was also going on the websites to see what they were talking about. And I also noticed that they were pointing to the fact of war. They're aware of war. They're aware that they're highly exploiting these women. And there was like a Q&A section that the website itself had curated. And the question and answer portion was something like, are these women going to be affected by the war negatively? And the answer was like, no, they're going to be fine. They're
Yeah,
familiar with English. Like everything is normal. Like they're trying to just continuously advertise these women as just like beautiful and happy. And it should be mentioned as well that prior to the war, Ukraine and Philippines were contending for first place for the last 20 years. It's always been mail order brides are coming from Asia or Eastern Europe and South American countries. And we're also coming to the United States, Canada, other European countries, and newly Japan. So it's interesting how
yeah,
we're not allowing like these refugee visas, but we're allowing trafficking. It's the
yeah,
same people who are coming in.
yeah. It's really shocking. And they're so aware of the war, these websites, like, because they would say, like, this is a way of supporting Ukrainian women.
Right.
So, this is a way of supporting women in a war zone, not like handing out the hand of, giving a helping hand, or like helping with, as I say, humanitarian, safe, legal routes for migration and refugees. It's just, yeah, by creating these sort of fantasy objects. And yeah, it was
And
very
speaking more
disturbing.
to the fantasy objects too, the websites go on about how divorce rates are lower because
Yeah,
marriages are longer, but that's because the women, there's so many issues with that we'll talk about later, but these websites just really know what they're doing on how to advertise for the women.
yeah,
Anyway,
precisely.
so why are women, I know we touched about it a little bit, but why are women even more vulnerable during this time? And do you think it counts as consent?
I mean, I think the reason that women are more vulnerable during a crisis is, it's for all the reasons we've discussed, really. Like, this is, they're living in a war zone. There's the main problem, the main issue is the lack of humanitarian routes for refugees. So again, we kind of always come up against this issue that, if you're not creating safe and legal routes for people to leave a war zone, be it Ukraine, be it Afghanistan, be it anywhere else in the world, then people are going to find dangerous ways of leaving their country and coming to another country. So in the UK, we have this real issue because there's such a lack of safe legal routes. We're seeing more and more people attempt really dangerous journeys, such as getting small boats across the Channel from France to the UK. And, there's been horrific tragedies where people have died as a result. And the government's response, rather than being like, okay, well, let's try and make it possible for people to claim asylum without having to get on a really dangerous dinghy, they're just coming up with more and more policies that are more and more draconian to try and what they're calling like deterrent mechanisms. But even the UK Home Office admitted in its equality impact assessment on these deterrent mechanisms that there was limited evidence to say that people are deterred by these policy decisions. So if we had better routes, if we weren't forcing people to come either through very, very dangerous methods or no methods at all, then we wouldn't have women in really desperate situations signing up to go to become mail order brides, or trying to match with people on dating websites. We'd have a sort of healthy, robust immigration system that would allow people to access safety when they're trying to flee, Russia is alleged to have committed mass rapes, torture, summary executions, let alone, the bombing and the shelling and the sort of day-to-day fighting of war. So, yeah, that's what makes women vulnerable. The war combined with a completely dysfunctional immigration system.
Yeah.
And in terms of consent, it's so complicated. And I think it's really important. When I was doing the investigation, I spoke to a researcher and we talked a lot about agency. Like, you can't take agency away from women. It's important to recognize that women have agency and they're not just passive victims, nor are they kind of, sort of agents of chaos. Like that, like we're all really complex humans, and we're all sort of trying to survive in patriarchal, racist, unequal societies in the best way that we can. And sometimes that requires making choices that we might not make if we did live in a fair, equal, just society. But I do think, there are important conversations to be had about consent if your consent is dependent on your survival. And if we're saying that if we have situations where women feel that they have no options but to have a sexual relationship with someone in order to be safe, and that cuts across all sorts of issues, be that domestic abuse relationships, be that kind of, just what the sort of mail order bride issue, be that in all sorts of kind of difficult, complicated, violent situations, then what does consent mean if we're saying it's dependent on survival? That's not the same as consenting to a sexual relationship because you really want to, or because you've got a spark, or because you're like attracted to someone and it's, you're having a lovely time. It's what does consent mean when it becomes dependent on something else?
Yeah, that really hit home for me. That was really meaningful, because what does consent mean if it's for survival, right? And it's not just on resting on your shoulders, it's also resting on your family's shoulders potentially, because if you're a young woman at a marriageable age, they could potentially make money. That's also part of certain traditions and certain cultures as well. So who are we to turn our nose down to that? So yeah, I don't know. It's obviously so complicated, and there's not one single solution to helping these women. I just think that we have to be aware of potential exploitations and harm that could exist, so that there could be safeguards in place to help them if they do choose this route. But most importantly, we talked a little bit about this already, about the UK and a little bit about Canada, but how and why is this legal?
I guess it's legal because, it is legal because they sort of position it as a sort of dating website with a marriage at the end. And as long as you go through the correct immigration systems and you get your spousal visa, and you've fulfilled all the terms of getting those visas, then there's, legally there's no problem. I think what's, and I think that's why there's the sort of term mail order bride is so frustrating in so many ways, because it doesn't really reflect the power dynamics. It doesn't really reflect the sort of gendered and racialized positioning of the brides and the grooms. But yeah, I mean, it's, from a sort of very basic perspective, I mean, it is legal because it's two people meeting and deciding to get married and moving countries to do so.
Right. And also each country decides together what their national law is going to be, as you sort of talked
Yeah.
about. And also forced marriage in international law, an agreed term for international marriage doesn't actually exist. So there's a lot of issues and papers for forced marriage and child marriage as a violation of human rights, but not international marriage. So that's why, and even through reading all of these different UN reports and toolkits that in preparation for this interview, not once did they mention male bride, overseas bride, like foreign bride, nothing, because there's no legal definition of that or agreed term.
And I guess it would just be so complicated to legislate against because, people do meet like a partner in another country and you do go through that process of getting spousal visas, and it's like trying to kind of legally define it is quite challenging as a result, because you wouldn't want to cast suspicion or doubt on a couple who are just happy to be together and want to, like, do you know what I mean? It's like, and and I think that's almost part of the problem, is you sort of, because of these stereotypes, it kind of casts suspicion on people who just meet a partner from Eastern Europe or the global south and they want to get married.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. So again, just briefly, some of the international protections for these women that relate to marriage are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where it provides the right for women and men of full age to get married, and it emphasizes free will and free consent to the intending spouse. The Convention on Consent to Marriage and the minimum age for marriage and registration of marriages. So again, it talks about free consent for age. Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, now known as CEDAW, but again, that has just to do protection with women in general, not explicitly brides. And Sustainable Development Goal number 5 for the 2030 Agenda calls for gender equity and the empowerment to women, and it refers to trafficking in persons and children. So there are a lot of tools that are floating around the concept, but nobody is pinpointing it exactly. Can you please describe the barriers to reporting and identifying abusive practices in these marriages, such as like, why don't they leave if so many bad things are happening?
So my investigation just looked at the websites. I didn't speak to anyone who'd gone through the process, because as I said, I was interested at like looking at how it related to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I mean, the question, why didn't she leave, is one obviously that comes up again and again and again when you write about violence against women and girls. The there's lots of answers. Like the main answer is because it's not easy. Like it's the most dangerous time is in an abusive relationship is when a woman leaves. That's the time when she's most likely to face fatal violence. I don't know what the situation's like in Canada, but in the UK, we have had a real crisis in terms of support services for women fleeing domestic abuse. 1 in 6 refuges were closed between 2010 and 2017. I think that's the correct year. We have situations where on a single day, 150 women are turned away from refuge help. Mm-hmm. There's a really fascinating book by an author called Rachel Louise Snyder called No Visible Bruises, which really just deals with the question of why doesn't she leave? And the answer that she comes to is because sometimes staying is the safest thing to do. That you make the calculation that where do you go? Where would you go? Where would you end up homeless? Would you end up with your kids taken away? Do you end up losing your support networks? Do you end up dead? Like sometimes it's safer to stay. And that's a failing of society.
Mhm.
We should have a robust safety net for women trying to flee abusive marriages or abusive homes. And the fact that women make the calculation that it is safer to stay, it means we have failed, like catastrophically.
Right. Yeah, I would completely agree with that. Some of the things that I found were that sometimes their families were also part of the forced marriage. So, again, the families back at home, husbands included, they wanted to
Yeah.
make money from this transaction. They anticipated that, or they also wanted the wife to sponsor their family eventually to come
Yeah.
to that new country. There's a stigma attached in some countries. If you go overseas to get married and suddenly you come back and you're not married, well, you're not virginal anymore, you're not a good wife, so there's you and your family become stigmatized. The trafficked spouses also often lack information about their basic rights of being in an abusive marriage. They think that if they
Yeah.
report this to the police or to an organization, that they will be deported, and they don't want that. Wedding agencies or these organizations like we were talking about use a lot of it requires a lot of money, so family members willing to sponsor them put a lot of pressure to say, like, how dare you even go against me, I'm the one who paid for these things. And then lastly, there are consequences for loved ones. So in Canada, if a friend is consulted, the friend could then be punished by law. In some cases, there's consequences for the friend who was just there to be a consultant. So, it's really tricky getting around all of these difficulties and to actually get information to these people who are foreigners, foreign to the land, foreign to the language potentially. So, they're extremely isolated.
Absolutely. And it's also why it's so important to have funded specialist services like that work with specific communities, because of all the different kind of language barriers, cultural sensitivities, the understanding that pressures will be different depending on your cultural or religious background. And again, we've had this issue in the UK of sort of the defunding of public services over the last 12 years of domestic abuse services and specialist services working with women victims and survivors have lost a lot of funding, or specialist services have lost out to kind of bigger organizations that don't specialize in either domestic abuse or in specific cultural connections. So again, it's just failing to fund, to support, and to protect women.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We're at the end of our interview today and about this episode. And I know we touched on some really heavy and deep topics, but I think that they're so important for people to know about. And I'm so grateful to you for coming. Is there anything else that you would like to discuss that we haven't talked on or touched upon yet?
The thing that really struck me the most when I was doing this investigation was just these kind of racialized and gendered stereotypes about women. And I think we really need to challenge these notions about what women in Ukraine are, or in other countries like Afghanistan, or in various countries in the global south. There's a lot of like mail order bride websites that focus on sort of Southeast Asian women, and again, it's that they're naive, that they're submissive, that they're obedient, and sexually voracious. It always comes back to sexually voracious in the end. And these are just like orientalist, nasty stereotypes that have no bearing in the reality of women's lives. You just have to look at the response of women in Ukraine to this invasion, the incredible human rights defenders speaking out, the women going to the front line, the women securing food and medical care for their communities, like the incredible bravery and strength of women in these absolutely horrific, desperate circumstances. And then we're still relying on these distasteful, racist, misogynistic stereotypes about what an Eastern European woman is in order, and I come back to this point over and over again, it's not it's there's these layers of exploitation, but the ultimate layer of exploitation are these businesses who are extracting money out of desperation and extracting money out of racialized and gendered stereotypes in order to boost their profits. And yeah, I just think we really need to we need to open our eyes to the damage this kind of stereotyping and messaging does to women's equality and safety.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we always end our podcast episode with how can listeners help from home?
Um, I think, I mean, one of the things that struck me when I did the investigation was how this was being used as a, hey, men, you can support Ukrainian women by shipping them over here as a bride. Like, you can actually support Ukrainian people by, donating to the emergency appeals, by making sure that you tackle disinformation, by making sure that share on social media really good, solid news reports from places like Kyiv Independent, from human rights activists, from women's rights activists who are on the ground, like really kind of counter those disinformation messages, and yeah, support the people of Ukraine during this horrific time with solidarity, and if you can, with donations, and by making sure that these nasty narratives about the war and about Ukrainian women are silenced.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was really lovely.
It was really incredible. And just so everyone knows, Sian Norris's book again, Birth Violence, is coming out in autumn 2022. Is there a release date for the book yet?
No, it's probably not going to come out till next year now, actually.
Oh,
Like, it's just publishing schedules moving around. But yes, hopefully 2023.
can you give us a little tease of what the book will be like? I know you said it's about women's reproductive rights, but is there anything that you're really excited for us to learn about?
Well, it's an investigative book with analysis. And I look at how extremist messaging about abortion and about women's bodies, looking really into kind of like really ugly far right extremist spaces, how that messaging and how that ideology has now become mainstream political policy in the US and in various European countries. And also I look at who funded that, who made that possible with lots and lots of money. So yeah, it's sort of, the idea is to go on this pipeline from extremist ideology to policy in parliaments.
I can't wait to read it because it could not be more topical right now. So
Sadly it is. I hoped it would be a history book, but it's
yeah,
currently a very present book, sadly.
right, right, of course. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great day, and just thanks again.
Thank you. It was lovely to meet you. Take
Okay,
care.
okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.